SDET-QA interview questions mainly for APIs, REST APIs, and let's get started. So first question that you can expect from API testing is like how to query parameters using an API REST assured. So this is a very common question, and expectation is that candidates should be aware of REST assured. So first thing is that you have to basically add your dependencies in Maven. So you ensure that you have added necessary dependencies in your project. If you pom.xml file. Next is you should be writing test using REST assured. Okay, so in REST assured, basically I've given the sample screenshot like how you should write. You can basically call the base URI like the API URL, and then you can just write the syntax like this: given, when, then format. That's the way we normally write for REST assured. So if you're using any query param after the API base URL, you can just keep, let's say I want to visit page number 2 of the APIs. You should give like this. And then if you're having an endpoint, you should give the endpoints like slash API users is the endpoint here. And status code normally for get, we should have the status code 200. And if you're verifying any of the API content like API output, any JSON tag, you should give like this, like body and then equals to 12. That's the way you should basically write. So here base URL is basically the normal API URL, and then also you should replace the query like in case you are giving query param. Okay, and then once you've given all the inputs, you should run the test. Okay, so let's see how it works. Syntax here. So for REST assured, base URI is basically a package that normally comes from io.rest assured. Okay, you can see io.rest assured, and it's basically a class. REST assured is a class that extends to object. Okay, and also given when, then these are also like belongs to REST assured request specification. Okay, and here I am giving like query param. So query param normally comes after the base URL. So base URL, then it will come like API users, which is the endpoint. After that, you should get your query params. Okay, and then the status code and then the body. So if you execute this test, okay, you should see it will fail because my expectation is 12, but I'm giving 10. So it will throw an assertion error. So if I pass here 12, I should see the actual response of the API. So you can see my test has passed. This is like a very basic level of REST assured script. You can use testng to validate your tests. Okay. Now let's go back to executor test class using preferred testing framework. Let's say testng or JUnit. REST assured will handle the HTTP request responses, and you can assert on the results. Okay, so make sure that REST assured documentation, you can just go through that and you can just verify these syntaxes. Okay. Next question is, what is the difference between header parameter and query parameters? So header parameters and query parameters, they normally serve different purposes and are used in distinct parts of the requests. So header parameters is basically used mostly for the location. The headers are part of HTTP request and responses, and purposes. Headers provide additional information about the request or responses, such as authentication credentials, content type, accept response format, and more. Usage. Headers are typically set in the request to convey the metadata about the request or in the responses to provide additional information about the return data. Okay, the way you should write is you just here you can you can put here header. Okay, and you can just say something like I want to put authorization. So I want to make sure I pass authorization for my API. Okay, so I'll put bearer. Okay, and then you can just say you can give your access token. So that's why you then that's how you should write the header parameter. Okay, once it is done, you can just enter your query parameters and next step. Okay, now what are query parameters? So query parameters are part of URL in the HTTP requests. So as I mentioned, as I showed you earlier, query parameters are used to pass data to the server as a key value pairs in the URL. They are often used for filtering, sorting, and specifying other parameters relevant to the resources being requested. Usage query parameters are commonly used in the GET requests. They are appended to the end of the URL after a question mark and separate by ampersand. So once you get the base URL, then your API endpoint, and at last you will see query parameters. Okay, in summary, like header parameters are a part of HTTP request and convey metadata about the request or responses, while query parameters are part of URL and are used to pass data to the server for specific operations on the requested resource. Okay, let's move on to the next. So, like define HTTP protocol in the API testing. So, in API testing, normally the HTTP protocol plays a crucial role as it is the foundation for communication between the clients such as applications, browsers, and tools, and servers. HTTP, which stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol, is an application layer protocol that normally facilitates the transfer of data between clients and the servers on the World Wide Web. Okay. API testing often involves interacting with APIs over the HTTP or HTTPS protocols. Now, some of the basic HTTP protocols in API testing are like GET, POST, PUT, DELETE, PATCH, HEAD, options, and trace. We'll go on one by one. So GET request is basically used to retrieve information, okay, from the server. Okay, so you are requesting some information from the server, you should be using GET request. Okay, typically it does not basically modify the server data. You cannot use GET request to modify any server data. Okay, server state. Next is POST. POST is used basically. POST request is basically used to submit data to the that to be processed for specific resources. Okay, it can create a new resource or update existing ones. So if you want to create a new resource, okay, or new data in the database, you can use POST request. For that, you need to basically create a request body. Request body should have the data that you want to create, and you can use a POST request, okay, to save the data in the database. Put request. Put request is usually similar to the POST, but typically used to update a resource or create if it does not exist. So put is basically same as POST, but it normally used to update the resource or create, okay, if it does not exist. Now delete. Delete is request is basically used to removal of a resource. So you can remove a resource and typically it does not include a request body. Patch. Patch is used to apply partial modification of a resource. Okay, but it is similar to put, but it is more focused on updating specific fields. Okay. Now head. Head request is similar to get, but without a response body. It is used to retrieve metadata about a resource. Options. Options request used to describe the communication options for the target resource. And trace. Trace is like used to perform the message loop back test along with path to the target resource. So these are basically the HTTP protocols that we normally use for um, used in the API testing. Now, obviously, each of these requests should have a HTTP status code. Now, common status code that we should be using are 200, which is okay. 201 created, 204 no content, 400 bad request, 401 unauthorized, 404 not found, 500 internal server error. Okay, let's go to the next question. Okay, so what does it means that method is HTTP method in HTTP is idempotent? It is very common question that interviewer might ask. So in this context, HTTP and HTTP method is considered as idempotent if it's performing the same operations multiple times. Okay, and it gives the same result. In other words, an idempotent operation can be repeated multiple times without causing different outcomes beyond the initial application of the operations. So some of the key characteristic can be like safe and read-only operations. So idempotent methods are often associated with safe and read-only operations that don't modify the state of the server. Okay, these operations can retrieve information without altering the server data. Next is no side effects with repeated request. That means when an idempotent operation is performed, subsequent identical requests should not be produced. Okay, should not produce different results or have unintended side effects on the server or its data. Next is repetition without concern. So clients can safely repeat idempotent request, knowing that the outcome will be same as if the requests were made only once. Okay. Next, so some of the common idempotent methods are like GET request. So retrieving information from the server, okay, is an idempotent operations. Repeating a GET request multiple times should not change the server state. So normally when you are fetching something, you should request GET request. You should use GET request so that same response you can get from the database. Put. So when you are like updating a resource using put is also an idempotent. So if you send the same put request multiple times, the resource state on the server will be the same as if the requests were made only once. And then delete. Deleting a resource using delete um, request is also idempotent. If you delete a resource and then attempt to delete it again, the result will be same. Okay. Now some of the non-idempotent methods also we'll discuss here, like post. Post request is actually not idempotent because creating a new resource using post is generally non-idempotent because if you're repeatedly sending the same post request, that may result in multiple resources being created. Okay, depending on server's implementation. Similarly, patch. Applying partial modifications to a resource using patch is often not idempotent. Repeating the same patch requests might lead to different states on the server. So understanding the idempotence of HTTP methods is important for designing robust and predictable APIs. It allows clients to handle failures and retries without worrying about unintended consequences when repeating requests. Okay. So next is what is basic token and bearer token. So basic token and bearer token are two types of authentication mechanism, and that is commonly used for HTTP based authentication. These methods are often used in the context of API security. First is we will try to understand what is basic token. So basic token like differences in format, like we normally use username and password for basic authentication, and it's basically combined with colon and then base 64 encoded. Normally you cannot highlight your password, right? You should encode the base 64 using base 64. The resulting string is sent to the authorization header of the HTTP request, okay, with the word basic followed by encoded credentials. Now, usage is while basic authentication is simple, it is less secure compared to other methods like bearer token, especially if used over insecure channels without encryption. Okay. Next is bearer token. So bearer tokens are typically used in OAuth 2.0 authentication. In this method, a token is generated by an authentication server and is sent in the authorization header of the HTTP requests. Okay, with the word bearer followed by token. So usages bearer tokens are widely used in the modern web applications and APIs. They provide a way to authenticate requests without sending the actual username and password with each request. Instead, the token is used to verify the authenticity of the client. So we understood like what is basic and bearer token. So in summary, like basic tokens are involving sending actual username and password with encoding, okay, base64 encoding, while bearer tokens on the other hand involves exchanging the username and password for an access token, which is then used for authentication. This is generally considered more secure, okay, especially when used with HTTPS. So in nutshell, bearer token are more secure, okay, than basic token. Next is like how many HTTP status codes have you seen in API testing and automation? So this is like mostly asked in most questions they will ask HTTP status code. So you need to remember these. So normally if you put get request, if you send a get request, you should get 200, and 201 is for post created, 202 accepted, 204 no content, 206 partial content, 3x redaction is 300 multiple choices, 301 move permanently, 302 move temporarily, 304 not modified, 307 temporary redirect, 308 permanent redirect, and normally 2x and 4x is mostly asked, and 5x. So 4x is bad request, 401 unauthorized, 403 forbidden, 404 not found, 405 method not allowed, 409 conflict, 429 too many requests. 5x server errors like 500 internal server error, 501 not implemented, 502 bad gateway, 503 service unavailable, 504 gateway timeout, 505 HTTP version and not supported. So 200 to not 1, to not 4 you will get the question from interviewer. Then 400, 404, 401, 403, 500, 502, 503. These are widely asked questions in the interview. Like how to verify 500 code series. So in 500 code series, like first you will set up a rest assured framework. Like then in the add before method, you normally configure rest assured with the base URI of the API. Now this setup will run before any class. Okay. Now next is you just make a API call. Okay. Like given method, you should start with the request, then header method sets the content type header to the application JSON, then body. It should like body method sets the request payload, which is then used, which is an example for intentionally invalid to trigger a 500 error. Okay, and the when method normally specify the request body and the endpoint. Now it's just like normal rest assured call, and then you how will you validate? So you can use then method begins the process of response validation, and then status code 500. So internal server error is normally has a status code 500. So you should use assertion checks that the response status is 500, and the log.if error logs the response details if an error occurs. Okay. So these are the steps that you can use to verify the 500 status code series. Okay. If you pass an invalid value in the path parameter, then like what will be the response? This is also a very widely asked question in the interview. Like something if you pass invalid, what could be the response? Okay, so first is you'll get 400 bad request. Okay, like if the server detects the path parameter is malformed or invalid, it might return a 400 status code indicating that the request could not be understood by the server due to client error. Then 404 not found. So 404 not found is like if the path parameter specifies a resource that does not exist, the server might return a 404 not put status code indicating that the requested resource could not be found. Then 422 is like unprocessable entity. In some cases, the server might return a 422 status code if the path parameters are syntactically correct but semantically invalid. And obviously, like 500 internal server error. If the server encounters an unexpected conditions that prevented it from fulfilling the request, it might return a 500 status code. Okay, this might happen if the server does not have proper error handling in the invalid path parameters. So these are the normal status code you can verify in your code. Next question is like I want to test, like this is the scenario level question. Let's say the interviewer might ask you like I want to test APIs for a login scenario, but developers did not provide me the APIs. So how can I test the APIs? So this is a very tricky questions. Normally, what happens? You always get the developer always provides like API endpoints, like authentication parameters they might provide you. Okay, username, password, API keys. But what if they do not provide you? So like testing APIs without direct access of actual API endpoints provided by developers can be challenging, but there are several strategies you can employ to work around this situation. First is mocking the APIs. So like you can use several tools like Postman to create mock servers that simulate the behavior of the actual APIs. Okay, you can define the expected responses and behavior based on the API documentation on and expected behavior. You can also generate mock data, like using the mock server to generate expected responses for different scenarios, successful login, failed login, etc. Now, there are several public APIs or existing documentation you can check. Let's say you can use like Swagger APIs. Pet Swagger APIs are public APIs. Um, you can go. So I'll try to show you. It's when these are publicly APIs. You can use like get, post, put, get. So you can just come down below. You can see like if you want to create a user, you can see like okay, you can try it out. Basically, this is a like response, and you can expect. So you can basically create a Pojo class, and basically we'll discuss this later on. So you can basically try it out, and get request also you can try out. So you can click here and you can just give a username, password, and execute. This will give you the get request. So that's how normally there are so many freely available APIs. You can try it out, and you can these are very handy if you don't get proper like in API endpoints by the developers. Okay, and next is API documentation. So you can refer to any API documentation or specifications like OpenAPI Swagger to understand the expected request and response formats. Then next is you can like collaborate with the developers, like request API access, like work with the development team to gain access to a staging or development environment where the APIs are deployed. Then API specifications, you can ask developer to provide API specifications like OpenAPI Swagger files if the actual endpoints are not available. And preferably you can create a local setup, okay, where you can deploy backend services and test the API directly. These are normally like steps you can take if a developer hasn't provided you the API endpoints. So in conclusion, like by using mock server, public APIs, API documentation, collaborating with the developers, you can effectively test the login APIs and other endpoints even when the actual APIs are not directly provided. This approach allows a QA to validate the test scenarios and ensure the application handles different responses correctly. Okay, so let's go to the next questions. What are the functional test cases normally you will write? when you are verifying an API. So functional test cases for the API focuses on verifying that the API functions correctly and meets the specified requirements. These states typically include validating the requests and responses, checking the behavior of various inputs, and ensuring that the API handles errors appropriately. So some of the common functional tests are like verifying successful GET request. You can verify successful POST request. Now verify 404 not found for invalid endpoint. Verify 400 bad requests for invalid input. Verify boundary values for input parameters. Now you can verify unauthorized access, verify formatted access, verify like data integrity, verify responses. So for example, like if you want to verify performance, like there also can be some test cases where you can verify the response time. So you can basically like send a request, okay, to the API and verify response time. So you can write something like this. I'll go to the code. You can just then you can mention here then dot time, okay. uh, Less, you can say like that, less than, okay, then 2 milliseconds, less than 2 seconds. That's how you can basically say, okay. Okay, so that's how. So here, if the request time response is more than 2 seconds, then the API execution will fail. So that's how you can basically check the performance. Okay, another way is like you can verify the data integrity. So you can check like if there are any special characters in the data by using like Hamcrest matchers or matching the regular expressions. You can try that, and you can also check like if like verify forbidden access. So you can check like if the status code is 403, okay, 403. So you can check the forbidden access, okay, and then body. You can say like error message, and you can mention like the actual message which is there in the API. So forbidden, okay, you you do not have permission. So normally if you execute this API in Postman and you have given something, you are expecting status code, Postman will return this error message that forbidden, you do not have permission, right? You can verify this in the same way in the code, okay. Similarly, you can verify like boundary values. You can check like if the like let's say if the error message is like equals to invalid ID parameter, you can give certain boundary values. You can check like maximum and minimum, you can check, okay, and that's how you can check the boundary value. Also you can check 400 bad request. So in that case you can just put 400 here. So this kind of status code verification you can do in API request, and that could be a very handy test case. Next is how to perform JSON schema validation using RestAssured. So this is a very commonly asked question. So for that, you need to basically add your Maven dependency. Like it should have JSON schema validator library in your project. Like if you're using Maven, you can add the following dependency in your form.xml. So and then send a request to the API endpoint using RestAssured and obtain the JSON response. Okay. Load the JSON file schema from a file. Let's say you want to verify the JSON schema from a JSON file. You can copy the JSON response and put it in a JSON file, okay, and then you can use that to parse the JSON schema using JSON schema validator. Now validate the JSON response against the schema using matches JSON schema provided by RestAssured. So it's an assertion normally used to validate the JSON schema. So for JSON schema, make sure that you have a JSON schema file, okay, that defines the structure of the expected JSON response. You can create this file manually or generate it based on your requirements. Additional note, like you can basically add your API endpoint URL, okay, and ensure that JSON file is correctly defined to match the structure of the JSON response from an API. So this you can try out. So this is the way I have done. So you just create a function for testng, and then create a response. Okay, so this will be io.assure.response. Okay, and then you get your API URL. This is my API URL, and so I have created a JSON viewer file. So normally you just copy this. If you want to see the structure of JSON, you can just go to your any of the code beautifier. So you can try this. You can I normally use code beautify. So you can go to JSON viewer, okay, and you can type the response. You can see the tree structure. So this is the response of my API. Now I will copy this. I'll copy this, and by clicking the download button, and then I'll create a JSON schema file, JSON viewer.json. Okay. Now this I'll verify with the actual response from the API. The response which API is throwing, I will verify that with this file. For that, I'll use file utils. File utils class I'll use, and I'll use read file to string method. Okay, to call this file JSON viewer.json. Okay, and then I'll use matches.schema. Matches.schema is a basically a assertion that normally used to verify the JSON output. So the response that you are getting from the API, this API, you just compare this response with the JSON file, and using the matches JSON schema assertion, and that will confirm that if the response is matching or not. Okay. Now I'll just run this in a debug point, so we'll see how it works. So you can see, like, here my file is actually reading my JSON file. You can see the JSON file is content is here. If I click on it, it will show the content. See, the content is coming up. Now my response is already there. So this is the response. Okay. Now I'm just using assertion. So I will just use a word expression, and this will return the response that it's matching. Okay. If it's not matching, it will fail. Otherwise, if it's matching, it will definitely pass. Okay. So that's how you basically check whether response is matching or not. Okay. I'll execute this once again in a non-debug mode. It will take some time, but it will respond without any error, and it will say that my response is actually matching. Okay. That's how you normally verify using JSON schema validator. Now let's go back to the slide. Next question is, list few common JSON parsing techniques used in REST assured automation. So we normally use like using JSON path or JSON path using ham-pressed matches that we have just seen, like the matches we have used just now. You have seen it. Pojo mapping, also like Java. This is a concept of Java where you create the user class or any of the uh, class file where we create objects and we create setters and getters. We encapsulate them and we use that for mapping to our REST assured response and request. Okay, and then we also use XPaths for XML response and then custom passing logic. So these are some of the methods that normally we use, or some of the JSON parsing techniques normally we used for REST assured automation. Now, what is serialization and deserialization of POJO in REST assured? So serialization is a process of converting a Java object into JSON representation that can be sent as a part of HTTP request body. In REST assured, when you specify a Java object as the body of an HTTP request, REST assured automatically serializes the object to the JSON format before sending the request to the server. Whereas deserialization is the process of converting JSON data received from an API response into JSON object, Java object. In REST assured, when you receive a JSON response from an API call, REST assured automatically deserializes the JSON response into a corresponding JSON objects, allowing you to work on the response data in your test code. Okay. So in serialization process, like you are converting like a Java object into a JSON. So as I mentioned, like you need to create your Pojo class, Java Pojo class, and then you have to use that to map with your JSON representation. Okay, rest assured representation. So we will discuss this in the next session. So thank you very much, friends, for today's session. If you like my video, please hit the like button and subscribe my channel.